Hello and welcome to Breaking the Consensus here at Protect Life. Thank you for joining us. Before we start, I'd just like you to hit that old subscribe button and hit the like button. And then also, if you can at all, if you can help us out, there's the little donate button down there. Anything you can give us will be really appreciated. Tonight, I am delighted to welcome back to us Mary Kenny. I'm hoping you can see this. There's the book Mary has it's just out in hardback. Mary Kenny, The Way We Were Catholic Ireland Since 1922. Thanks a million for joining us, Mary. I'm really looking forward to having a chat. We're probably going to have more than one chat tonight. We'll have chat tonight and then we'll come back. I don't think we'll get it all done tonight. So that's something for the viewers to look forward to. So thank you for joining us. First question out of the box. Why? Why The Way We Were Catholic Ireland Since 1922? What made you want to write this book?
Well, I suppose the obvious first idea is that it's 100 years since the foundation of the Free State. And that's 100 years of the, obviously Ireland became a republic then in 1949, but it's the centenary of the 26 counties, which has been generally regarded as a Catholic state. But I sort of felt I wanted to probe into more of the nuances, of this state, which was the country that our parents, really identified with and grew up in. And I suppose the second thing is, I'm 78, and obviously, people of this vintage are moving towards the departure lounge of life in a way. And so I suppose we're looking back on the history of our time and just before our time. And of course, I have that quote at the beginning from the great Christian philosopher, the Danish philosopher Kierkegaard, who said, life has to be lived forward, but can only be understood backwards. And I really, really believe that that's true, because the longer you live, the more you start to look back and try to understand, and you do understand more of the past. And I suppose a third point was, I did feel in the media that I'm more focused on the faith rather than the institutional church. I'd like to make that clear. But at the same time, I feel in the media the church has taken a tremendous battering over the last 20 years, and the Catholic faith is constantly regarded as something negative, as something toxic, as they say. There's constant references to our dark Catholic past. And, obviously there were dark episodes and there were, scandals and wrong things occurred, but it wasn't all like that. And I think that's the point about looking back on history, is that you want to see it in all its complications and all its paradoxes. And I suppose above all, I wanted to see it through people as well. And I suppose to some extent, there's an element of memoir, but I don't put myself, I hope, center stage, but I do interweave some of my experiences where I feel they're relevant.
Yeah, it's interesting you said there through people, because one of the things that it struck me the first time I read it was, I would say this is a lightly written book, but not a lightweight book. And I intend that very much as a compliment.
Thank you.
I think it must have been a choice, or was it? Maybe it was just the way it evolved, that rather than approaching this maybe like an economist or a historian and write a book which was data driven or whatever, you've told this story through the lives of people. Again and again, you use people that you have known, or people that were known to your family, or people that were prominent members, and you use incidents from their life or their words to explicate the moment that you were talking about from the beginning on through. So was that a choice you made to tell the story through this narrative, as it, because that's the same, you're not a historian, you're a writer. And you
Yeah,
told this narratively.
I mean, I'm very, very interested in social history. You know, I
Mhm.
think that's the fascinating part of, you know, of human life. And so I suppose I talked about the things that drew me and that interested me. Um, you know, for example, the 1930 in the 1930s, a very clever American anthropologist came to Ireland to study Irish social life,
Mhm.
Conrad Arensberg, and he lived for 2 years in County Clare, and he observed, you know, farming life in small farms in County Clare. And I mean, this is a riveting observation about the way people lived. And of course, my parents would have been young people my mother would have been in her 30s at that time. And the way in which he describes, um, you know, that uh, really he has this interesting view of the Irish that yes, it's an austere life because life is poor. It's really hard to, you know, sort of make a living out of a small farm in Ireland. And yet there is another side to it, which is that he sees a sort of great merriment among the Irish, and the way in which they have this puritanical side, if you like, which is to some extent driven by their circumstances. But on the other side, they have this jolly side, and he sees this. And interestingly, he describes the relationships, for example, between shopkeepers and their clientele, and it absolutely matches what my mother told me about life in East Galway when she was growing up, such as, you know, you always went to a particular shop because that
Mhm.
was the shop that you went to. And if they didn't have what you wanted, you accepted it. You didn't sort of say, oh, well, I'll go and shop somewhere else. That idea of sort of competitive capitalism or mercantilism probably, hadn't really come into the culture. You put up with it, and because the relationship with the shopkeeper was more important than getting your own special brand of sultanas or whatever.
Yes.
No. And I suppose the
That-
other side too that I saw, which fascinated me, English tourists who were beginning to come to Ireland in the 1930s, you know, once the memory of the Troubles had died down somewhat. And, you know, we think of Ireland as being quite, you know, De Valera's Ireland, very, very, again, very strict and austere. But some of these English tourists again found great jollity. For example, you know, horse racing was very strictly controlled in England, and there was very strict laws about gambling. You know, but you could enjoy as many horse races as you liked in Ireland, and you know, and Sunday was so jolly they found in Ireland because the Irish went in for sports on Sunday, whereas British life was very Sabbatarian. It was very dour on a Sunday. So there were all these little vignettes which fascinated me.
I know that English commentators were people who liked to bet. One of the things they would often comment on it with a great pleasure was the fact that there were bookie offices all over the place, but there were no bookmakers' offices in England. The GAA, of course, traditionally played its games on Sunday, etc. It's a funny thing you say. The thing about the shopkeeping, when I read that, this you might find curious. I talked to a lady who had been involved when some of the non-native multinationals came in here, and they introduced their opening hours. And they had to change them because they discovered that when they had assumed that the model here would be the same as England, when people arrived and the shop wasn't open, she said there was the assumption that, well, they would just come back. But here on Sunday, there was the assumption that the thing would just be open because we'd had that tradition. That was always the thing. Catholic shops would open on Sundays. Church of Ireland shops, Methodist, Presbyterians were much more serious about the Sunday rule here.
Yeah.
And in a town like mine, where you had a significant population, Church of Ireland population, a lot of the shops would close, and that was one of the manifestations until recently, and that you could see that distinction. I'd like to go back to the beginning, to the birth of the state, and you make this distinction between the romantics and the pragmatists. That the pro-treaty are the pragmatists, Michael Collins et al. These are the pragmatists, and then the other side, the romantics, or perhaps, shall we say, the extremists or whatever, if we want to put it like that. While there was this sort of temperamental difference between the two groups, was there a difference in their Catholicism, do you feel? Or were they basically similar in their style? Was their faith the same, but somehow their temperament different? Was there a difference in their Catholicism, do you think?
Well, I suppose that might vary according to individuals, but certainly the Republicans, the ultras who wouldn't recognize the Free State and remained and were often excommunicated by the church. Indeed, they were, so many of them, they were absolutely ardent Catholics, ardent and mystical Catholics. I mean, somebody like Ernie O'Malley, for example, who's a terrific writer, an amazing IRA man, and he was a very, very spiritual man. He carried the imitation of Christ with him everywhere. And even when he was excommunicated, one of the things about the Republicans, they always found their own priests, in a way. There were always priests, because naturally, quite rightly, a priest should not refuse to be a pastor or a chaplain to anybody who seeks them, really. But they did have to put up with a lot from the institutional church, and they had to go and sit in the pews in mass, and they listened to bishops and so on, giving out yards about them and calling them terrorists and murderers and so on. And some of them were gunmen for sure, but it was this paradox that fascinated me. And I wrote a bit about my own mother. Now, my own mother, in her own life, she would have been really she would have been bourgeois, if what the French would call. She liked culture and pretty things and pretty houses and things, all those normal things that she wanted. But she wasn't interested really in politics at all. She had very little interest in politics, but she absolutely adored Liam Mellows, and the Galway man, the statue of Liam Mellows is there in Eyre Square in Galway, because he was such a romantic figure. It's this idea of sacrificing everything, of willing to go the full mile, to do anything for his ideals. And he was very left-wing, Liam Mellows was, and he was really more or less Marxist. I think he was completely against private property, for example, which wouldn't have gone down at all well in Dublin 4, but yet, she thought he was a beautiful romantic figure. And of course, he went to his death, so bravely, to the firing squad, and he asked for a priest, and a priest came forward to give him the last rites, even though he had been excommunicated by the church. And my mother thought that was a wonderful story, and she just liked it. It was like, I suppose, Sidney Carton in A Tale of Two Cities almost. That appeals to the romantic imagination, the idea of the person who was willing to sacrifice everything. And I think that strain was quite deep in the Republican side. I mean, the 1916 leaders were really of that ilk to a large degree. People like Sean McDiarmid, is a wonderful character. But then you had really the more pragmatic people who would say, look, we've got to build a state, and it was a very poor state, and they really had a mountain to climb, building that Free State, and they really did everything. It seemed to me anyway, they made a very sincere effort to build a Free State and to build a state that could stand independently. After all, there were people in the British press writing things like, these bog trotters can never run a state. They were writing that sort of thing. And yet these young men, and they were mostly men, came out of Catholic schools. They formed a very good administration in the civil service, and they got on with it. And of course, they did things like reduce the old age pension. Ernest Blythe did that, which was very, very unpopular. But those people, the civil servants who were counting the pennies at that time were saying, it has to be done. You know, we've got to keep the state going.
I know. I met my grandmother, who was born in 1900, would not countenance ever voting for Fine Gael because they'd taken a shilling off the old age pension. And I'm talking like this was 80 years later. But talking about women, actually, you make the observation, which is not, others have made before, that there's the role of women in this area, the relationship in women and Ireland and the church or whatever, the idea of the subjugated woman, and the fact that in the Republicans, many of the women tended to seem more radical, but there was, and in this discussion about gender roles, you quote Maura Cruz O'Brien, something I thought was really interesting, when she talked about the brother-sister relationship in Ireland as being one of the most important relationships. I don't know, it's a small thing, but I thought that was a really interesting insight. Because again, in my own experience, but just also reading history, I think thinking of that makes a lot of sense to me.
It does, yes. You see, I suppose, I mean, looking at the background of the men who set up the Free State, and not just the politicians, but the administrators, and they were very important, really. You know, starting a civil service is very important. But if you look at these, and the men who sort of set up the Shannon electricity scheme, and all that was part of the early building of the Free State. They nearly all came from bigger families. I mean, people did in those days. Even in Britain, people tended to come from bigger families. You know, the founder of the BBC, Sir John Reith, he was the last of 7 children. That sort of thing was very common. But so you had many of these early Free Staters, they came from families of 10 and 12 children. And of course, if you had in a family of 10 or 12 children, the siblings do become very important to each other, I think, because the parents are up to their eyes really raising these kids, you know. I sometimes think also that the people from those big families, in some ways, they were less spoilt and entitled, you know, than some people in our time, really, where in a way, you know, children don't have to sort of accommodate other siblings quite so much, you know. So I do think that those big families formed their characters. But and I thought, and Maura Cruz, it was just an observation, but I suppose she was thinking of people like Terence MacSweeney, I guess, and his sister Mary. And Mary MacSweeney, a remarkable woman, a bit of a fanatic. That's absolutely true, but nevertheless very interesting, very intelligent, very bright, and absolutely carried, you know, the flame of her brother Terence MacSweeney's death all her life. You know, she was the one who really did it. And I think that you do often see that in Irish life, that the sister is the one, perhaps more than the wife sometimes, who carries the flame and who has the deep relationship with the brothers.
When what is sometimes unkindly, I think, called the B team takes over and forms the government in 23, because that sense that the great men have died or have been shot or executed. What do you think it's true to say that they went about creating a state very conscious of the accusation that home rule would be Rome rule? They were aware of this, they were conscious of this. So in that first 10 years of the state, before the Fianna Fáil win the first election in 31, then De Valera goes in 32, I think, the first single party government, do they avoid it? Do they avoid what is essentially a confessional state? Or is it, in fact, is the Free State a Catholic state, do you think?
Well, my contention is really that the Catholic identity of the state only started in the 1930s for a number of complicated reasons. But because I do think the early Free State, they did make an effort to be inclusive, and they did ensure that there was a very large cohort of Southern Unionists in the Senate. mostly Anglo-Irish gentry, sometimes the mercantile classes like Andrew Jemison, you know, the whiskey magnate, and you know, people like that. It was Henry Guinness was there, and also very important, I think, man, Greer, who was a very skilled at at running the National Stud. I mean, this was a very important business, really. And some of those old Southern Unionists, you know, brought a lot of talents really into what was the Oireachtas, or was then called the Parliament at the time. And so it was very self-consciously that they did try to include. And of course, a lot of those people, their families had been burnt out by the ultra Republicans. You know, their stately homes had been burnt out, and they were doubly targeted then because they were senators of the Free State as well as belonging to the old gentry. So, you know, there was that effort really to be a bit inclusive. I mean, it's true that divorce was prohibited in the early years of the Free State, and the Church of Ireland had a very serious debate about this too, you know, because the Church of Ireland was by no means composed of swinging liberals, you know, who you know, on the contrary, they were Protestants sometimes claim they take marriage more seriously because Catholicism has a tradition of celibacy. But the Reformed Church, of course, has always wanted its clergy to be married. That was Luther's idea, that marriage was a good thing for men and women. So there was a serious debate about that, and the Protestant Archbishop of Dublin in the end came down on the side of the state and backed that report.
That debate was the source, or the location, if you like, of one of the most famous speeches, parliamentary speeches, which is Yates's famous speech against the introduction of a ban on divorce. It's maybe a silly question at this difference, but from the perspective of creating a notionally pluralist state, but even just generally speaking, do you think it was an error to introduce the ban on divorce at the time? Or
well,
is it
when you think that it took until 1995 to get a divorce law past the Irish public, and even then only by 0.5%.
Yes.
You know, I think you have to bear in mind the democratic difficulty that you know, might have been met, actually. I mean, I suppose what they could have done was sort of ignore the whole thing, might have been more sensible, I don't know. But Diane Urquhart at Queen's University in Belfast has published an academic book about divorce in Ireland, and does approach it from a liberal point of view. Nevertheless, she points out that even when Ireland was under the control of Westminster, the British always avoided imposing any kind of liberal-like divorce on Ireland. The British knew that the market was very tough in Ireland about divorce. And of course, because it was so tied up, leave aside the faith issues, it was deeply tied up with land.
Absolutely, and I think that sense of property was what I know certain people feel was one of the reasons why the first attempt to abolish divorce, remove the interdiction against divorce, was actually failed, because of concerns in the country about land, and a lot of women who were concerned about their own well-being, their property. But you use the word market there, and you referred to your own experience of the nature of newspapers, that newspapers follow the market. And in a sense, am I right in saying that your sense when you talk, even in the 30s, you say when Fianna Fáil and De Valera, even though De Valera you describe as quoting somebody said the most devout Catholic anybody that he'd ever met, but at the same time not necessarily diffident to the institutional church, a remnant of that Republican anti-clericalism that's still there. So, but this is the moment when we shift. But is this simply the inevitable consequence of a state where 95% of the people are not just Catholic, but when asked, and even this in the 60s, you quote out the surveys, not just Catholic, but are happy to be Catholic, are content with their Catholicism, who like the church, who think the church is doing fine, that to expect that the state that evolves out of that population will not reflect that population is to ignore the market, in a sense, that the state is following the market rather than leading the market.
Yes, and I suppose that is a difference between academics and journalists, is that journalists are very formed by the idea that you have to know who your readers, what your readers want. It's not, you can't dictate. I mean, people say the media is powerful. Sometimes the media is powerful, but it is constricted by what the market will bear always. So I think that my formation is probably very influenced by that. And I did, one of the things that was very interesting to see was that with the newspapers, the three main newspapers, in national newspapers at the time, were the Irish Times, the Irish Independent, and the Irish Press, which De Valera started in the 30s. And the Irish Times at the time was a unionist paper, and they knew their own market very, very well. Then the Irish Independent was always, at that time anyway, very clericalist. It always had, pictures of priests and nuns going on the missions, pages of priests and nuns going I mean, I suppose now a terrific archive. They can see every priest and nun that ever went to China or to South Asia. And the Irish Press at the beginning was, as you say, it was a Republican Fianna Fáil paper, but it wasn't clericalist at the time, really. It was always a bit more, detached and independent, detached from that sort of clerical view. But the Independent sold, the more copies, the more they wrote about priests and nuns going on the missions, the more copies they sold. You can't ignore that market. It was huge, and people wanted to know about, Ireland's spiritual empire. They were very proud of these brave nuns and priests who were, going abroad, and the Vatican cherished so much the Irish people who served throughout the world. So this was a source of pride. And I suppose the celebration or the centenary of Catholic emancipation in 1929, 100 years since Catholic emancipation, and Daniel O'Connell won that, and then the Eucharistic Congress in 1932. These, although they were very done with dignity, and people, enjoyed these festivities in a very orderly and benign way. Nevertheless, they both sort of added to the notion of the Catholic identity of the state. And
the Eucharistic Congress was a huge event, wasn't it?
Yes,
I think it's very hard for people to imagine today quite how big a thing the Eucharistic Congress was. Huge, absolutely. And it was very, G.K. Chesterton wrote a very nice book about it. And it was very international, very cosmopolitan. And, Dubliners really joined in with great joy. And also, what was quite important to the Irish sense of self-esteem at the time was that it was done with perfect order, and that we showed the world we could organize a huge thing like this at a time when the Irish state was really still a very fledgling state, So there was a notion of national pride. It did actually draw on, because I read through the archives, the Royal Archives in Windsor about this too, for a previous book. It did draw on considerably on the old royal visits to Ireland, in a sense. It did mirror to some extent the way that was done. And the British were
were absolutely understanding. It was quite interesting because, you know, De Valera told the king, that was George V, that he didn't have time to come and talk to him about the dominions because he was organizing the Eucharistic Congress, you know, and the king absolutely understood this, you know, because the Brits understand ceremony, you know.
Yes, and ritual.
They really understand ritual and how important it is and how it signals so much, you know. So it was, I mean, De Valera he had a struggle with his conscience as to whether he should wear a top hat or not, you know, because it might look a bit too posh and upper class, but in the end he was somehow persuaded to wear it.
Tell me, do you have any sense, did you come across any reference to how Irish Protestants experienced this?
Well,
I mean, I've read accounts of, and I've talked to friends of mine about what it was like when the Pope visited John Paul II, which was such a massive event. Is there any, have you come across any accounts of what Irish Protestants felt about this event?
well, there is a good book called Irish and Protestant, which is edited by Ian Dalton and I think Ida Milne, and that has a lot of interesting perspectives and good perspectives on that. And I suppose some Irish Protestants, certainly there was a little bit of an argument at the time of more at the time of the centenary of Catholic emancipation. There was a little bit of argument in some Church of Ireland, there were a couple of Church of Ireland voices saying, you know, you shouldn't be triumphalist about that. But I suppose, you know, Catholic emancipation had been, when you read Antonio Fraser's marvelous book actually about the king and the Catholics and how, you know, Catholic emancipation was won in 1829 in the teeth of a huge amount of opposition, you know, from the establishment. You know, it was enormous. So I suppose one could be forgiven for being a tiny bit triumphalist about that. But I suppose my own, I mean, I grew up in Sandymount in South Dublin, which was a very much mixed Catholic and Protestant neighborhood. And I mean, relations were very, very good. You know, neighborhood relations were very good. But what was the personal relations were very good, but there was a certain amount of understanding and respect that people had different spheres to some extent, you know, and that you come back to your point about Sunday, because the Protestant children couldn't play on Sundays and they couldn't come to the pictures with us, you know, because Irish Protestants were very Sabbatarian, you know, and they observed the Sundays very, very, very much so. So you had those divisions, those social divisions in society which existed, and which I'm glad to say, you know, obviously that's something that's gone completely.
Yeah, I know a friend of my mother's what carried a personal regret about the celebration of the emancipation, because he was born that year and spent the rest of his life glorying in the name Emancipation Man. Which I think more people should be called Emancipation. But I'm conscious of the time, so I just want one last question, and then we'll come back later, because I don't want to keep you too long, because I know, you know, like it is the season of the head cold. But just one thing, and dancing is a big issue, and it kind of feeds in. You're talking about the perceptions of people who come and have one set. On one hand, there seems to be a terrible suspicion of dancing and restrictions on dancing, and dancing is it's an occasion of sin, and you know the old thing about keeping room for the Holy Spirit and all that. And at the same time, because I know this is true until this day, when English friends come over to an Irish wedding and we go to an English wedding, you know, we think it should be getting going and it's all over. The dances here are going till 4 o'clock in the morning, and we seem to keep different hours. These two islands, what was, is this an example of where, when we actually try and separate the culture, we say what the real Irish culture is, but take the Catholicism out, is actually a silly thing. That the church has been here for 1500 years, And to try and identify what is Irish and as opposed to what is Catholic is a kind of a waste of time. And the dancing thing represents maybe the temperamental differences of people. Or was there a kind of a more blanket church approach which was just ignored? But anyway, I suppose the central is it my sense reading the book, because it comes up again and again, that the dance and the dance hall and dancing was a really central part for a very long time of Irish society.
Yeah, especially from the 1930s to the 1950s. Like when I was a schoolgirl in the 1950s, Dublin was awash with dance halls of every conceivable kind. And, you know, on a Saturday night, you know, you had a choice of, people had a choice of like 25 different dance halls, you know. So there was but it was back in the 1930s. The priests certainly, I suppose, at the instigation of the bishops, really, there were sermons, stern sermons against dancing. That was absolutely true, and it was considered. At the same time, they wanted to do Cayley dancing, Irish dancing, which of course is less. It less leads to intimacy, shall we say, you know, than ballroom dancing. So that you had those sermons against dancing, and there were restrictions brought in 1935 on dance halls. But again, I think you've got to look at the wider culture, which was people. There was a lot of you had people like Mary Stopes getting a lot of publicity in Britain about birth control. So there was a lot more. People were becoming much more aware of a more of you know, frankly, sexual candor in a way, if you like. There was much, and you know, you had you know, people like D.H. Lawrence, although they were banned, it was spoken about, you know, and so on. So there was a sort of social anxiety about sexuality, which, you know, was part of the context, I think. And then there was, and that, you know, people would lose the run of themselves. And there was also another fear, which was that the motor car was bringing all sorts of strange cads and bounders into a local area where they could, you know, have their wicked ways with, you know, young girls at dances, where before the era of the motor car, everybody knew who everybody was at a particular location, but with more social mobility. And there was one other factor which John Healy suggests in one of his books, that that the generation who had lived through the Spanish flu were some of those older people were terrified of crowded places.
Oh, yeah, COVID today. Yeah, and still absolutely. Many people have that experience, very worried about those enclosed spaces.
Yes, John Healy says his mother didn't want them to go near a cinema or a dance hall because she had nursed people through the Spanish flu and seen people die in the Spanish flu. So there were all these different social factors, complicated. Having said all that, John Gibbons, who was an English travel writer, came to Ireland, and he thought the dances, I think, you know, he thought he said it was sort of Babylonian sort of glee. I mean, he thought they were amazing. And as you say, that they went on so late, they went on at midnight, they went on at 2 a.m, whereas in England a dance had to finish at 11 p.m. and that was it. Yes. And the English, of course, would at that, in those days, be very law abiding, you know, and the bobby on the beat would come and close the dance, you know. But in Ireland it went on, so you had all those paradoxes really going on of the dance hall being the den of iniquity, and at the same time, it obviously had a terrific attraction for people. Later on, you know, it became very legitimate, and church halls began to hold dances, you know.
I know, and I'll leave it because I'm conscious that I've already taken more time than I promised I would. I can't remember, you may be aware of a little book O'Foylon wrote about the history of the Irish, and then he talks about the dance hall, and he makes the observation that while you have bishops here and there preaching desperately against it and trying to stop applications for dance halls being built. At precisely the same time, the Bishop of Raphoe was building dance halls in a desperate attempt to try and keep the young people from emigrating either to Dublin or to Glasgow. So
Yeah.
the story was never a single line, was it?
No.
And I'm going to thank you for joining us tonight. We will be back because we still haven't got to the Constitution, so we'll probably kick off there. But for tonight, I would like to remind again the people, the Mary Kenny's book, which is available in all good bookshops and online, and would make a lovely Christmas present coming up for people. Great read. But thank you for joining us, Mary, and I'd like to thank our audience for joining us. And again, click on the button and join us again next month. Mary will be back, and hopefully we'll have a longer chat and we'll get to the end of the book. We'll get even into the 21st century. Thanks again.
Thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure.